Welcome back. The Pentagon will stand up a new Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy job. Kaitlyn Johnson currently performs the duties of that job. Kaitlyn Johnson, no relation, is Deputy Director of the Aerospace Security Project, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Kaitlyn, welcome. Thanks for coming back on the program. This job will live, it sounds like, in the office of the Secretary of Defense. Where does it fit in your view in the hierarchy of space jobs across the department?
Sure, I think it's definitely an elevation of what was already ongoing, from a deputy assistant secretary to an assistant secretary. It elevates the mission of space policy and gives more authority to the person who is confirmed in that role to go forward and coordinate across the department. It was also required by the FY 2020 NDAA, so it's a little maybe late on that as we are already into FY 21. But as you said, right now it's filled by Kaitlyn Johnson, who's acting because this requires a nomination from the president and an appointment by Congress.
What does this say about the way that Congress, because it's a requirement in the NDAA, wants the department to move forward? It's striking to me that we're seeing so much positive interest from Congress when for so long most people seem to be opposed to the idea of a Space Force altogether. And now there's, I guess, success has 1,000 fathers.
Sure. So I think for me, it's really about civilian oversight. And that was a big, it's always been a big thing in our military to have this civilian oversight. And with Space Force being elevated into its own service and Space Command being stood up, we saw a lot of movement and a lot of authorities being created on the military side of things. So this position will give some much needed civilian oversight and able to coordinate across the department with other offices in DoD, the different services, intergovernment coordination, working with state and commerce as well, and NASA, as well as our international partners and allies.
So this person is going to be the connective tissue among all of the space organizations that will remain inside the Defense Department. I think there's a misunderstanding from people who kind of watch this from the outside that everything space is going to move to the Space Force. That's not the case, just as all aviation in the military doesn't live in the Air Force. Am I reading that right?
Yes, I think so. I kind of been thinking about it as a puppet master, pulling the strings of space policy, making sure that we are all, or the Defense Department is all moving forward in ways that support one another and make sense with the policy that comes out of the Office of the Secretary of Defense. We saw in the past 6 months what is time these days in COVID, but we saw the space power doctrine. And so I think implementing that doctrine and the policies that were outlined in there will be top of the list for this new secretary.
Another job I want to ask you about, just get your takeaway from the establishment of it. Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Space Acquisition and Integration. Where does that job fit in this whole landscape, Kaitlyn?
Sure. So because the Space Force is still part of the Air Force, this assistant secretary within the Air Force will have jurisdiction and influence in the Space Force's acquisition and integration. This is also a politically appointed position, so we'll be waiting on a nomination and Senate appointment, and was also called for by Congress in the FY 2020 NDAA. So these two positions were created with the same thing in mind of civilian oversight and being this puppet master of all things, this one, acquisition for space. Right now, their goal is to do everything so that it's set up, they're connected within all of these different acquisition organizations that already exist within the Defense Department and in Space Force. But I think a key challenge will be making sure that we don't have duplicative efforts across these different organizations, and that the efforts that are being made are doing so, in good coordination with one another and helping support each other.
What else is on the radar screen as far as workforce across Space Force or space policy making in the Defense Department, Kaitlyn?
Sure. Well, I think, having an assistant secretary in OSD policy as a policy person myself is very exciting. I don't think it'll change a lot about the policies initially, but it's definitely over the long term will make an impact in getting more space policy experts into the Office of Secretary of Defense, who's already been doing some great work on that. But we're also watching more people join the Space Force. Service members from the Air Force have been accepted and are rolling in. There's a Space Force ceremony that will be taking place on the ISS, because that is where the new soon-to-be Space Force member is currently residing, which is an interesting ceremony, I'm sure, to coordinate. But also looking at, moving forward, will other service members from the other services, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marine Corps, switch over to the Space Force, and how many?
Kaitlyn, about 30 seconds left. What will you watch, if anything, in any of the legislation that's working through Congress now? Still have an NDAA deal to do?
Yes, they do. And obviously the election and the coronavirus have taken their toll on our normal operations for the NDAA and space. So we're kind of waiting to see as that changes. But also, I think everyone is sitting on pins and needles right now, waiting for election results to see how Congress will shift and how potentially the administration will shift, to see if that, in fact, will also impact space policy.
Kaitlyn Johnson, thanks very much.
Thank you.